give a couple of minutes for everybody to get settled in. And my name is Richard Howarth. I'm with Square Books. This is one of our Crossroads book discussion groups. And I know some of you have attended many of these, and those who are back, welcome back. And if you're new, welcome, especially welcome you if you're new. I know everybody's dealing with the weather, at least around here in Oxford we are, and COVID, and all I can say is there's something on the other side of this hill. And it's going to be good. I'm not sure what. Most of y'all know that we started the Crossroads book discussion group shortly after, almost immediately after the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, as a way of talking about race matters and using a book to do that. And we've had some very interesting discussions. Our guest host today is Brian Foster. Many of you will remember him by virtue of his recent book, which he did an event here for. I Don't Like the Blues, Race, Place, and the Backbeat of Black Life, published by the University of North Carolina Press. Dr. Foster is a professor of sociology and Southern studies here at the University of Mississippi. Our guest today, Jemar Tisby, received his BA at Notre Dame, Master's in Divinity from Reformed Theological Seminary, and is presently working on a PhD here at the University of Mississippi, focusing on race, religion, and social movements of the 20th century. He is the author of a previous book, The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism, and the book that we feature today, How to Fight Racism, Courageous Christianity and the Journey Toward Justice. We will have signed copies or book-plated copies of that shortly if you wish to order that. He discusses in this book, he suggests in this book that we move beyond discussion about race and racism and begin equipping people with tools to deal with it, to fight it. Before I turn this over to them, over to you, Brian, just a couple of announcements. We'll have an event here tomorrow at the same time. Christina Henriquez, author of The Unknown Americans, will host Laird Hunt, who's got a slender new novel, Zori, that was praised by Roddy Doyle as, quote, beautiful, gentle, and full of surprises. Cody Morrison, many of y'all know Cody, he's the buyer here at Square Books, is very keen on the book and fond of the woman character who's the title of the book. For today, my only bit of housekeeping is to remind y'all that if you have questions during the course of the conversation, you may submit them by the chat or Q&A mechanism, and Brian will field those toward the end of the session, and Jemar, we believe, will answer them. So thank you both for doing this today. It's a pleasure to have you both here, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jemar, what's going on, man?
Hey,
how you doing?
We were just talking about the weather in not the quotidian mundane way, but the historic cold and snow way. So
Right.
I think the fact that we both have power and are able to do this event is a good sign. Although we were supposed to be in person, so I'm looking forward to the day when that can happen.
Someday soon, I hope. I'm Richard promised that there was something on the other side of this. I'm going to take his word for it that there is. I wanted to start. How to Fight Racism is your second book of this type, and I say of this type, a book about racism, a book about thinking critically about racism, in particular as it relates to the church, kind of in both a generic but also kind of a specific sense. What brought you to this type of work? What brought you to writing about this topic in this way? And we'll get into questions about audience at some point, but what brought you to this type of work?
Well, from an academic perspective, I am more and more persuaded that there's no way we can adequately understand the problem of racism and white supremacy in this country if we don't understand the religious aspects, and particularly as it pertains to Christianity. Obviously, most of the attention goes to the racism and white supremacy in which white Christians were complicit and supportive. But there's another side of the story in the Black church and the ways that it utilized religion and Christianity to fight back against racism. So just from an academic perspective, I'm always interested in the religious elements of race and racism. But partly it's autobiographical. I am a person of faith, and a lot of the time I've spent in faith communities, I have been in predominantly white spaces, whether that's church or the college environment or what have you. And so I'm dealing with these issues personally, issues of racism, and especially back in 2015, 2016, when the immediate past president was a candidate and getting elected. I personally experienced incredible and acute forms of racism, ostracism, due to was just being my Black self in these Christian spaces, and they just didn't have a theological or ecclesiastical vocabulary for what it meant to push for justice as a person of faith. So those two factors combined makes me want to write about this stuff in the hopes of improving conditions for folks who are, in my situation, or just Black folks and people of color in general.
I suspect that we get How to Fight Racism to address some need. I suspect that you saw a need. Perhaps that's a funny way to put it. I wonder if you could talk about that. Why did you write this book question, or kind of what space are you feeling that you kind of felt needed to be filled?
Well, let me answer that through the book's title, How to Fight Racism. One of the things that I absolutely still can't wrap my head around is there's no book by that name. It uses similar words, similar phrasing. There's How to Be an Anti-Racist, right? There's, books on how to, etc. But there's no exact book on how to fight racism. And that to me speaks to the need of the real practical tools, step by step, discrete actions I can take as an individual, or maybe my institution can take. So the gap was this: whenever I speak or write about racism, the most frequent question is, what do I do? And I love that question, actually, because it says, number one, you realize racism is still a problem. It didn't end with like the 1964 Civil Rights Act or something like that. And then number two, you want to be part of the solution. So this book is my sort of book-length response to that question. And I think it fills a gap in the existing literature, which focuses a lot on the diagnosis, a lot on sort of personal story and memoir, but that really how-to part, the okay, so what do we do part, I think needed more explaining.
It's the thing I appreciate the most about the book is that there are all of these very practical and I guess practicable lessons throughout from start to finish, and you give kind of this grand kind of framework relatively early in the book, the arc of racial justice. Before we talk about that, because that starts to get to this practical piece that you mentioned. What is racism? right? How to fight racism. What are we fighting? What
Yeah.
is racism?
A very important question. And in The Color of Compromise, especially, I borrow from Beverly Daniel Tatum's book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she explains racism in a very simple terms. Racism is a system of oppression based on race. And what's crucial in that definition is the system part. I'm sure most of us have heard accusations of reverse racism, right? When Black people don't like white people, which is totally possible, right? Prejudice, it crosses the color line. Anyone can have racial prejudice, right? But not everyone has the power to enshrine their prejudice into policy. And that's the crucial difference. That's how racism has been formed in this nation. So when I talk about racism, I want to emphasize the legal, the policy, the structural aspects that create and perpetuate inequality along racial lines. Another shorthand definition is prejudice plus power. Prejudice plus power equals racism. And, obviously there's a lot more we can go into, the history of it, the social construction of it. But what I think is important, especially in our national discourse, is to emphasize the systemic and institutional nature of racism.
Which you do in different ways and in different places, but you also kind of keep close by this. It's the language of personal responsibility. It's the kind of pathways for individuals to work, to do what's in the title, fight this thing that has been kind of embedded in the country since before the country called itself a country. You start to, like, as I mentioned, you give us you kind of start to lay out the roadmap early on, and you do so with kind of this. It's a heuristic. It's kind of an acronym, ARC of racial justice, ARC of racial justice. I wonder if you have some things to say about that. Could you talk about what the ARC of racial justice is, and kind of and how that fits into this fight that you have framed for us?
Yes, thank you for that. So I structure the whole book around it. There's three parts, one dedicated to awareness, the other to relationships, and the last to commitment. That's what ARC stands for. And it really comes out of my practical experience. I've been talking and writing about race publicly for about a decade now. And again, that most frequent question, what do we do? I used to give just sort of this scattershot of answers. It would have been whatever was on my mind at that point, which could have been helpful, but it also felt very disorganized. It felt easily forgettable. And so what I started to do was think of a framework that could help us not just sort of identify practices, but categorize practices for a more holistic approach to racial justice. I believe you need all three of these parts, awareness, relationships, commitment, to have a sort of robust approach. So, it's pretty self-explanatory. It had to be simple if I was going to remember it. So, it's going to be memorable for anyone else. So A is awareness, and that's the knowledge, the information, the data, the statistics that we need to understand race, racism, and white supremacy. It's listening to podcasts. It's watching events like this. It's watching the documentaries, etc. But we can't just have big heads about this. There's a sense in which we have to have big hearts. All reconciliation is relational. And to the degree that people sort of change their minds or broaden their perspectives on things, oftentimes it comes through knowing someone who's lived a different reality than you, and can open your eyes to the fact that we oftentimes live in different Americas based on our skin color. So the relationships aspect is important, especially because in the United States, white people have done so much on purpose to separate themselves from Black and brown folks. You're going to have to be intentional about breaking down those barriers as well. But I think where we go wrong in a lot of our efforts to fight racism is that we strictly focus on the interpersonal. It's all about individual attitudes towards someone else. And so racism for many people is, oh, I don't like Black people, or I use a racial slur, or whatever it might be. Therefore, if I don't do those things, I'm not racist and I'm not part of the problem. But the issue is much bigger than that, right? So you get the line, some of my best friends are black, uh, all too often, ad nauseum. But at the same time, that's great. Don't be mean to black people, but all your little, your cups of coffee, your cups of tea, that's not going to do anything about voter suppression. All of your, pulpit and choir swaps or whatever it might be, that's great. Don't stop doing that. But it's not going to do anything about the crisis of mass incarceration or whatever other issue there may be. So that's where the C comes in, the commitment to actually changing laws and policies and practices at the systemic and institutional level to be able to fight racism, not just one person at a time, but as an entire society.
I wanna go ahead and interject a question from the Q&A, because it kind of fits into this last point that you made, or that you just made, kind of perfectly. Please explain the difference. This kind of backtracking a little bit, but asking for a little more detail. Please explain the difference between structural racism and bias prejudice.
I would say, structural or systemic racism operates independently of any individual's personal attitudes. So we tend to define racism as, some malicious person behind the curtain pulling the strings because they don't like Black people or Latinx people or whatever it might be. Well, the fact is, when you set these systems or the procedures or the policies up, they have functioned so long in a particular kind of way that you don't need any individual bias. You don't need any individual prejudice for it to work out in unequal ways. So for instance, at the university level, what does your board of trustees look like? Now, there may not be any person on that board who's sitting there and saying, we don't want any Black people on here. But your practice has been, we access our own social networks. Predominantly white, predominantly wealthy, and guess who you get as board members, on and on and on. That's one common example, but you can look at laws and policies and practices, right? So if you look at, the killing of Mike Brown in Ferguson, one of my questions as both a citizen and a scholar was, how do you get a neighborhood that's predominantly Black like Ferguson and a police force that's predominantly white? That didn't happen by itself. That happened through policies such as redlining. It happened through policies such as the origins of the police force, which have a lot to do with controlling Black bodies and not just this vague idea of law and order or serving and protecting, right? So what I'm trying to get at is, once you sort of set this thing in motion, you don't need any individual's bias to keep it an unequal system. It was a system that was built by and for white people to begin with, and all you have to do to let it perpetuate inequality is let it operate.
A part of what you do here is in the book is talk about how to study the history of race and racism in this country. Yeah. I wonder if you could, maybe don't. Well, I don't know. I was going to say maybe don't give away all the goods, but with something like this, maybe it's worth it. But I wonder if you could talk about some of the practical ways, and you alluded to some of that just now. Right. Some of the practical ways that folks who are interested in taking up this fight, how can they approach studying, learning more about some of what you just alluded to?
Oh, don't get me going. That's chapter 4. That's how to study the history of race. That was right up my alley. I had fun writing that chapter because history is my thing. Let me give a real practical step for people listening or watching. Go to blackperspectives.com, the Black Perspectives blog, and there's an article by Carrie Lee Merritt, Merritt. It's a couple of years old now, but it's called One Continuous Graveyard. One Continuous Graveyard. That was a hugely important article for my understanding of the origins of the police force. And she makes an incredible point that prior to the Civil War, a lot of municipalities didn't have a line item for a standing police force. If there was an issue, they gathered a posse, they got their guns, and they went and took care of the problem, which most of the time was poor white people, because all the Black people were under control in race-based chattel slavery. But then after emancipation, Now you got 3 million or more free Black people. And now you're all of a sudden saying, oh, we need law and order. We need, a system to punish, lawbreakers. And, because of the root, you get the fruit, even on into the 21st century. So one of the practical aspects, in addition to reading articles like that, is learning from academic historians. Dr. Merritt has her PhD in history. And if you go to, the few brick and mortar bookstores that are left, thank you, Square Books, you're not who I'm talking about here. But if you go to some of the big chain bookstores, when you look at their history section, a lot of it's not historians writing. There might be journalists or just interested parties. They focus on military history and presidential history, maybe some sort of like sordid, mystery kind of stuff. But there's not a lot of work by academic historians. So you got to look for books by like the University of Mississippi Press or others that are written by scholars. By the way, most of it's pretty accessible. Scholars want people to read their book, even if it's written for an academic press. But anyway, go to those sources because they've been vetted, they've been peer reviewed, they've been subject to, the standards of a particular academic discipline in a way that a lot of trade and popular books are not. So I give a whole, I think half a dozen ways in that chapter to really help you explore history in a more responsible way.
I'm teaching a methods class now. I was teaching a methods class last semester. Classes that are similar to what you offer in How to Fight Racism, in that there's lots of talk of practical ways of doing something. One question that I often get is, how do I know if I'm doing it right?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder about that question in this context. This is a book that, among other things, I think one of its defining characteristics is that it tells folks what to do, or it offers some models for doing things.
Right.
Are there any methods, any tools, any heuristics that folks might also employ to assess whether they are doing the work right? Is that the right question to ask? Am I doing it right? I wonder how you might deal with that type of question.
Oh, such an important question. Is it being effective? Right. That's a critical question. I would say a few things. Number one, is it working for the most marginalized among us? Is it working for the most marginalized among us? I live in the Delta. And historically, this is the poorest part of both Mississippi and Arkansas. It also has the highest concentration of Black people. All of that is connected to the history of race-based chattel slavery and then sharecropping thereafter. Point being, if our racial justice efforts can work in a place like the Delta, we're on the right track. If it is not working for the most marginalized, if it is not working for the most disfranchised, if it is not working for the most oppressed, then we need to keep working and refining and getting better. So it's really a people-centered kind of approach in terms of who are you trying to come alongside and support, and is it working for them from their perspective, which is easy because you can just ask the folks, is this what you need? Is this helping? How can we get better? So really centering the marginalized there. The other thing I would say is have as many data points as possible. So my first career was as an educator. I was a 6th grade science and social studies teacher and also a middle school principal. And it irked me to no end that most of the way we were evaluated was based on a single annual standardized test, which is terrible. I mean, that's not a way you want to live in any other area of life, to have this one single assessment, which is standard, right? It's not tailored for any particular population. Matter of fact, it's more tailored to a particular population that is not low wealth and Black, and have all kinds of evaluations based on that one test. So a better approach is you have many different data points, both quantitative and qualitative. So for our racial justice efforts, we want to do interviews, we want to do focus groups. We also want to measure data and statistics based on, whatever sphere we're trying to influence. So having many different data points. But the last thing I'll say is this, and it doesn't get talked about much. How do we know it's working? Part of it, a big part of it, is it working out there? Is it changing the world and impacting society for good? But another part of judging the effectiveness of our efforts is how it changes us. So the longer I do this work, the more I realize that it's not just about changing the world out there, it's about changing who I am inside. And so this is the kind of work that builds empathy, that builds solidarity, that builds courage, that builds humility. And it's those virtues, these sort of universal virtues that really only grow in the context of pursuing justice. And so I think that's another data point, is another way to think about how effective we're being.
You say you've been having these conversations for a decade, and I know you have been. The book is out. This book is out now. I know you've got The Color of Compromise, and so you've been engaged in these conversations a lot as of late. I wonder, have there been like challenges, or whether it's how have the conversations gone? But it's more a spirit of in terms of I guess seeing folks or hearing of folks trying to implement, trying to do this type of work.
Right.
What are some of the challenges that you've seen?
Yes. So for white folks, the challenge is twofold. Number one, to move beyond simple awareness. I'm not denigrating awareness. We're educators. We're in the business of building awareness, and that is an action of its own, right? But to move from awareness in a really intentional way is the thing, right? So beyond hashtag activism, which I'm actually not denigrating either, because it's a 21st century way of organizing, or it can be. But beyond the retweet, how is your life orientation actually changing? Because as a white person, you are passively benefiting from a white supremacist system. So how do you become actively anti-racist, right? So it's helping people to know that you're either actively racist, passively racist because you're benefiting from an unjust system, or you're actively anti-racist. The second part of that for white people is keeping the light switch on. And so I use an analogy in the book of a light switch and a smoke detector. And the difference between the two is that a light switch you can flip on and off. A smoke detector has to stay on all the time in order to be effective. And so for Black people and people of color, race is a smoke detector. We have to constantly be aware. We have to be hyper vigilant, and it's exhausting. But we have to do that because if we don't detect the smoke, we're going to get burned by the fire of racism, right? For white people, though, it's a switch. You can keep that switch off and have no real sort of material effect on your life. You can still get the job, you can still have the income, you can still get the health insurance, whatever it might be, and not have any meaningful interaction or solidarity with Black people and people of color. So the challenge is keeping that light switch on. For Black people and people of color, especially the book like How to Fight Racism, it's like, why do I need to read this book? I do this every day, kind of a thing. And so I totally get that. I understand that for us, survival is fighting racism. Survival is a victory of a sort. But I do think this book will be helpful because in every chapter, I include two parts. One part is racial justice practices, which is the concrete action steps. The other part is called essential understandings. And that's sort of a framework for how to understand race. And I think that can be beneficial for everyone, but especially for Black folks and people of color who feel like, we're already engaged in this work. This kind of articulation of a racial framework, I believe, can help us refine our understanding and practice. So it's building interest among people whose lives already depend on fighting racism is one challenge, and saying that as much as we have lived experience and personal stories, there's a science and a practice to this that we can all get better at.
The other side of challenges, I wonder if there are success stories is the wrong word or the wrong kind of terminology. But I wonder if there are examples or considerations for either individual cases, or I guess I both know, but also can imagine this how this book might be purchased and used in its institutional context,
Right.
churches,
Right.
for example. I wonder about the other side of how this work has been challenging, or some challenges that you've seen. I don't know if you would call them successes, or what the language is that you would use, but what have you noticed for folks or institutions that have employed this framework, for them in their individual lives, or in the context, in the institutional context? What are there any things that you've noticed, or anything that are worth sharing?
Listen, I'm about to send a message to my publisher, because we got to do an updated and revised version of this book in like a year, if not less, because the stories are trickling in. There's one church, Calvary Episcopal Church in Memphis, that's a historic church, a historic white church. It's literally, its property is adjacent to the slave market where Nathan Bedford Forrest sold human beings, right? And they've taken of late a really aggressive stance in confronting racism, and they're using the arc of racial justice to develop a plan for their congregation and their church to fight racism. So that's really encouraging. I also hear stories via DM or online. There was one in particular that I remember, well, two actually. One, there's a white woman who has a full-time job, but she also teaches a Bible study at a nursing home. And she was saying that they're going through this book in that nursing home Bible study, and she's got 70-plus-year-old white women just feisty, we fight racism, right? Like, I love that. It's never too late. And then there's one more story. Somebody actually wrote me and sent me a handwritten letter. People still do that. A handwritten letter where I love it, because she had heard me speak a few years ago and totally disagreed with what I was saying about race. Then life happened. She went through some things. Her eyes were opened, and she started to revisit what I was talking about, especially on the systemic and institutional side of racism. And she wrote me this letter saying, listen, we were wrong, and we're so grateful for what you've been saying. Now we understand, and we want to be part of the solution. So stories like that are really encouraging, and I can't wait to hear more.
I wanna jump to another question from the audience, and I'll just say, if folks have additional questions, we will transition to kind of giving more space and time to those now, so you can drop them either in the chat box or the Q&A. But this question is another question about kind of the institutional setting. In this case, high schools, colleges, universities. The question is, has there been an effort to incorporate required coursework to graduate within the high school and university systems in understanding and fighting racism, perhaps using your step-by-step guide? So do you know of any high schools, any colleges, any universities that, I guess, do you have any thoughts about, there's been conversations about like diversity requirements and that sort of thing in the context of colleges and universities, or specific to your work, school contexts that have adopted either how to fight racism or otherwise, right? That you could speak to.
So in my experience, the most common way that schools are addressing this is by incorporating books or articles into a particular class material. So for my first book, The Color of Compromise, there have been several colleges and universities, as well as seminaries, that have made the book required reading. I appreciate that, because it's sort of organic to what they're doing. At an institutional level, it's a bit trickier, and we can especially learn from places like even the University of Mississippi, where when you make something like this required, there's a lot of foot dragging and resentfulness on the part of people who don't really care about it, want to remain where they are. So while it seems on the surface to be a solution, okay, this is content everyone is receiving, there's also a sense in which, because there's not really buy-in, whether at the trustee or administrative level or at the student level, it can actually it can actually cause a lot of issues that you have to work through. So what I think would be helpful is, um, here's the thing, I don't quite know how to articulate this, but when it comes to issues of racism, it is way beyond just what happens like in the workplace 9 to 5. It is way beyond someone's professional vocation, right? This actually gets to who you are as a person and your character. So I'm speaking to this group of um, business people and corporate leaders, and they want me to talk about, what you do in a corporate environment to promote racial justice. And it's really frustrating on a level because I'm like, it goes so far beyond what you're doing in your business. It goes to how you're living your life, right? And so in an institutional setting, you've got this. You've got to set up some systems and structures, right? Like you've got to have diversity, but also inclusion and equity, right? You've got to have the right people at the table. So one of the practices I encourage is hiring in clusters. So you're not just hiring that one Black person or that one Latino person. You're hiring a group of Black people, a group of people of color, all at one time. But in addition to that, you got to actually have leaders who really, really care about this. Leaders who think it's not just a business decision, it's not just to save face institutionally, it's because I actually want to be anti-racist and promote racial justice. So that's a character thing that's amorphous, sticky,
Yeah.
takes time, but I really think, you've got to have the people in place with the right lens and the right passion, really, to make lasting institutional change.
Fannie Lou Hamer, you mentioned her early and late in the book, toward the
Yeah.
beginning and toward the end. What, I don't know what you learned from Fannie Lou Hamer. What's the value of including her story, her voice, or
Get me
her
going again.
significance to you? Yeah.
Yeah, you get me started again. So I grew up in the Midwest, north of Chicago. Um, and when I came down south, uh, almost 20 years ago now, I had heard the name. I didn't know her significance or anything. But living in the Delta, she's one of the people you quickly learn about. She
Absolutely.
was born in 1917 to a sharecropping family. She was the 20th of 20 children. She could have lived and died in obscurity, as many of her peers did, but she went to a church meeting at William Chapel in Louisville, Mississippi, one day, and they did a presentation on voting rights. And when they asked for volunteers to go to register to vote, this is during the Jim Crow era, this is 1962, she raised her hand as high as it could go, she said. And thus began her public phase of activism. She had been, resisting her whole life. What I love about Fannie Lou Hamer, she was a radical. She was into radical democracy. She was all about the people, all about the grassroots, never left the Delta, never left poor people, not even just Black people, just poor people in general. Um, she combined that, though, with a very outspoken connection to her faith, which stands as an antithesis of the way many white Christians understood their faith, because they used their Christianity as a reason to back away from civil rights activism and to become what Martin Luther King Jr. called the white moderate. And so Hamer was outspoken about her faith actually fueling her efforts for justice. And so I think she's just an incredible example of somebody with a very sharp, sophisticated political vision combined with a very deep, authentic, grassroots kind of faith that presents sort of an antiphonal response to what we now hear or think about as like white evangelicalism.
Let- let's so Delta, Mississippi Delta. What part of the, like, what parts of the Delta are you most familiar with? Have you no, you've done quite a bit of work in the Delta
Yeah.
region. So what part of the Delta are you most familiar with?
So I got down here through Teach for America. They assigned me to a public school in Phillips County. So I'm actually on the Arkansas side of the Delta.
Uh-huh.
So I'm
Okay.
most familiar with the northern part of the Delta, but I spent quite a bit of time in Clarksdale. My wife taught in Sunflower County. So
Uh-huh.
I've been all over the place. And as a historian, man, I just love taking trips and following the historical markers.
So I want to ask about if there are lessons uh, that you have kind of picked up in your during your work in the Delta. So Fannie Lou Hamer, her voice and her work continues to echo.
Mm,
I wrote an essay where I talk a lot about her, you
mm,
know, a month ago, right? So
yes.
her voice continues to echo. I'm also empowered by the young folks and otherwise who I talk to and hear from today on questions of race and organizing and so forth. I wonder if there are any lessons that you've picked up from your time with folks in the Delta.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it goes back to a previous point where, how do we know we're effective? Basically, if it's good for the Delta, it's good for the nation.
Mhm.
Again, if it works for the most marginalized people, that's something we can run with. Um, I've also learned a lot more respect and humility, because the Delta lacks a lot in terms of material resources, money, jobs, formal institutions of education. But the Delta is rich. Oh my, is it rich in culture, in history, in relationships and family connections. People here ride for their own, and it is breathtaking to see. So to approach activism and organizing not as if we are the haves, you are the have-nots. Let us come and graciously bequeath to you all of our wealth. Is we're coming as equals, if not learners in the process. And that's with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, because they were a very grassroots organization led by Ella Baker and her sort of architecture of let the people lead themselves kind of a approach. I've really seen how that's powerful in a place like the Delta, because people don't have the letters behind their names, they don't have the titles, they don't have the formal education, and yet they are leaders, they are intellectuals, they are passionate pursuers of racial justice. So just allowing yourself to be taught, even in a position where most people would think, you have everything to offer and these people are needy. Oh, no, 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 no. We have so much to learn from the Delta.
We would need another hour to talk through that. I have thoughts on that too. What does it look like when we get where we're going? What does racial justice look like? Maybe that's for sure an impossible question to answer in a few minutes, perhaps. But I wonder any thoughts that you have. What does it look like when we get where we go?
Well, since a lot of my work intersects with religion and specifically Christianity, I think it means people of any race or ethnicity being able to walk into any congregation and feeling a sense of home, feeling a sense of place, that you are not automatically excluded or otherized because of your skin color or your culture. And so that means, it doesn't necessarily mean every congregation is multiracial or ethnically diverse. It does mean that every congregation is racially aware, actively working for racial justice, has probed its own history, is actively fighting against racism. Those places are places where anyone can enter into, even if it's just a visit, and feel accepted, feel heard, feel important. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think it should be utterly unpredictable, one's life outcomes. Because right now it's very predictable based on
Mhm.
zip code and skin color and access to certain resources like education and residential places of living, right? And what would it look like to have race not be this strong determining factor for quality of life measures? I just want it to be, you don't know. You know, it's based on the particular efforts of people, and not just where you come from or what you look like.
This is a book only for Christian folks, only for churchgoers, or not? I wonder if you do you have to you got to go to church every Sunday to take something from this book?
Thank you for asking that. Not at all do you have to be a Christian to read and benefit from this book. I really went back and forth on including that phrase courageous Christianity in the title. I did so for a couple of reasons. One, it's sort of the counterpoint to my first book, uh, you know, The Color of Compromise and Complicit Christianity, which goes along with the racial status quo. What would it look like to confront that? Well, you need a courageous Christianity. So that's part of it. The other part is I wanted truth in advertising. I'm definitely approaching this through a sort of Christian lens, but to the degree I talk about it, I'm talking about themes that I think are universal, like the dignity of all people, which in the Judeo-Christian tradition is based on Genesis 1, chapter 1, and verse 26 and 27, which is talking about, all people being made in the image of God and therefore having inherent dignity and worth, no matter what you look like, where you come from, what culture, what gender, all of that. I talk about concepts of, love, and like Cornel West, love is justice is love in public, right? So I think these are universal themes that people can latch onto. And then what we talked about at the top of the hour was, I really don't believe that we can wrap our heads around or our hands around this thing called racism unless we're dealing with religion, and specifically Christianity, because in US history, the two have been mutually constitutive. I mean, you really can't separate them. And to the degree that we do, I think we're missing a big part of that picture, but is accessible to absolutely everyone.
Yeah. We got another question that I'll kind of edit a little bit. It's a question about Latinos, Latinx folks, and I'll edit it to in this way, I guess. What do you have to say, or where do, I think this is a better way to say it, where do non-Black people of color fit into this conversation, into this fight?
Right. So white supremacy sets up this hierarchy which centers those categorized as white and marginalize anyone categorized as not white, which will include Latinx folks, people of Asian descent, Native American descent, and Black people. I talk about Black people, A, because I'm Black. I've experienced this from a Black perspective, and B, because in a white supremacist society, Black is set up as the inferior opposite, right? So whatever is in between, whatever is categorized as Black is the inferior opposite. You have different stories, different racial and ethnic stories, like the model minority myth for Asian Americans, like the horribly racist, mascots, playing off Native American tropes. And then, recently, especially, Latin American folks experience incredible persecution because of this crisis created at the border, right? So each of the stories is unique and different, but white supremacy affects us all. And the racial justice practices I'm encouraging in the book, from anything from learning history from academic historians to abolishing the death penalty, that's going to cross all racial and ethnic lines. That's accessible to anyone. But I think there's power in specificity. And so I may not be the one to write about Latinx history or racial justice, but you should, or someone should. And in being very specific to that story, that national or racial or ethnic story, I think there's a universality in it that's often surprising and counterintuitive, but true nonetheless.
I have one, maybe two questions about the book itself, and then I'll see if you have anything that you wanted to share or talk about that we haven't gotten to. How should folks read the book? Is it best to read it from page 1 to 2? Can I just kind of dive into chapter 7?
Right.
Do you have any recommendations for how folks should read the book?
Great question. So it is a practical book, and that's a very practical question. Um, One, I would encourage you to read it in community, even if it's with just another person, one other person. But if you have a book club or a small group or something, I would encourage you to read it together. We have an online book study group on Facebook. If you go to facebook.com/groups/HTFR community, facebook.com/groups/HTFR community, that's a 6-week study, and that's a pretty good pace. So you take about 2 chapters a week-ish and read that in community. The second thing I would do is add an extra week, or if you did it 5 weeks of the book study, add a 6th week for action. And so in this online book study, I'm facilitating what I call from moment to movement, a racial justice planning session. And so we're going to take 2 hours, walk through the arc of racial justice, brainstorm, plan, and actually begin executing on racial justice. So this book is impactful, or will have fulfilled its purpose, if you end up doing more than you've been doing. And so working that into the plan. But if you are going through it alone, or if you have been through it with a group, it is totally open to just sort of hopping around to different chapters that interest you. It's not a narrative in the sense that, there's a beginning, middle, and end story. Each chapter takes on a different topic and has different racial justice practices.
What are you proudest of in terms of the writing, and the craft of writing the book itself? As
Wow.
someone who's this ain't a book, a talk about my book, but my book isn't long out. It's been out for a few months, and I've got some pretty clear and distinct ways that I answer that question. Just thinking of the challenge of writing a book. Is there something, and this may be of benefit and interest only to me, but it's the last question. So
I
is
love
there
that.
is there anything that that when you think back on the process and practice of the writing itself, that you feel good about,
Yeah.
that you're proud of?
Yeah, I'm hoping the framework, the arc of racial justice and last, on the initial push of the book. I hope that gets into, strategic plans and things of that nature. I think I've got some pretty good sections of prose in the book. So for instance, I mean, I can't verbatim quote it, but like the last paragraph of the first chapter is designed to be kind of inspirational, call to action kind of a thing. I'm so very, very, very pleased whenever I can work Fannie Lou Hamer into something that I'm writing. Um, and I think just the existence of the book being a practical guide for people, I do think fills a need, I hope, and I'm just glad that the book exists.
Snaps to that. We got maybe 4 or 5 minutes. If is there something that is there anything else that I haven't asked that is kind of burning to or itching to get out, whatever metaphor we want to use? Anything that you want to say? Kind of any kind of last thing, any final words?
I'll say 2 things. One, for the people who tuned in and you want to scratch that practical itch, a couple of the practical steps that have been really resonating with readers so far. In the awareness section, I talk about writing your own racial autobiography. And this is good for people of color and Black people and white people as well. Oftentimes, when we talk about fighting racism, it's all external. What can we do out in the world? But there's a lot of inner work that we have to do. And so I give you writing prompts like, what's your first memory of race? Have you ever used or been called a racial slur? What did your parents teach you about race? Do you remember, some big national event or local event around race? And I really do encourage people to write it out, because that forces you to choose words, choose memories, figure out how you want to express them. And for me, writing helps me make sense of things. So my hope is that by writing your own racial autobiography, and you may not do, from year 0 to year 40 or whatever it might be, you might just, write about a couple specific events that were really impactful. But even in doing that, it's going to bring up more memories. It's going to bring up more ways that you can have a usable past, if you will, how your story intersects with a bigger story. Another practical thing to do is to talk to your kids about race and racism. And again, as Black folks and people of color, this is something generally we have to do. Although, you know, my parents were boomers, of the boomer generation, and success for them was access to white spaces. And so my dad, you know, had a cubicle in middle management at a pharmaceutical company, and that was unheard of for his parents, right? So for them to reach that kind of position meant you sort of downplayed race. You didn't bring it up unless somebody brought it up to you, kind of a thing. So they weren't necessarily all that explicit with us about talking about race. So I think this is pertinent even to Black people and other people of color, but especially also to white people who don't often, you know, have to have these conversations. And so I give a framework in there based off the arc of racial justice, but, you know, some guidelines are early and often. You know, kids already understand a lot more about race than we give them credit for. And we do want to be shepherds and guides as they develop their understanding. And number two, I think it takes some of the pressure off of us to realize you don't have to get it all in one conversation. You shouldn't even try. This should be part of a sort of regular dialogue that you're having with young people. So there's a lot of practical tips like that. And then the final word, pay attention to Christian nationalism. That is the thing that is wreaking havoc on not only churches, but on our political system as well. So my book came out January 5th, 2021. The insurrection at the Capitol happened January 6th, 2021. And if you look at the images, there's a lot of Christian symbolism there, from a big wooden cross to Bibles to signs saying Trump is my president, Jesus is my savior. All of these things speak to the reality of Christian nationalism, which is more of a cultural and a political ideology than a religious or a theological one. And it basically posits, you know, that America, the United States, is synonymous with the biblical church, and that, you know, properly understood, the United States is a white man's country, a white Protestant Christian man's country. And to the extent that it's not, and is going down the tubes. And so the effort is to make America great again by making America white Christian nationalist.
Yeah. I don't know how folks will feel about ending on that note, but I appreciate that as a nice exclamation point. I don't know if I think maybe they're having some tech difficulties. I think Richard was supposed to come back. Either way, there he is. So I'll just say quickly, I really appreciated this conversation, man, and we will talk, and our paths will cross probably sooner than later. So this is just the first of many. I appreciate it. I enjoyed it.
Hey, you asked great, thoughtful questions. Thank you for engaging with the book.
Thank you both
100%.
so much for the conversation, enlightening and inspiring both. Thank you so much for this hour and for the books that you've given us. Okay, folks, we'll see y'all soon.
All righty. All right. Thanks.
Thank you.